Like many people here on Reddit, I never thought I'd be writing something like this, but after what happened, I feel like I need to get it off my chest. My fiance, Daniel, and I were supposed to have the happiest day of our lives this past weekend. Instead, the day before our wedding turned into a complete circus, and honestly, I'm still trying to process everything. I'm angry, embarrassed, and weirdly proud all at once, and it's been a whirlwind since then. Daniel and I have been together for 4 years. He's an incredible person, kind, patient, humble, and one of the most hardworking people I've ever met. We met through work, but our relationship grew outside of it, and over time I realized just how special he was. I think I always knew he came from money, but he never acted like it. He drove an older car, worked long hours like the rest of us, and never flaunted anything. It wasn't until I met his parents for the first time that I realized how wealthy his family actually was. They live in a huge house, but even then, they're the most down to earth people you'd ever meet. In contrast, my family is complicated. I come from a big, loud immigrant family, and while I love them, they're not exactly the easiest people to deal with. They can be super judgmental, and they've always had this weird obsession with status and appearances. Growing up, it felt like everything we did was compared to other families in the community, whether it was grades, jobs, or who got married to who. There was always this unspoken competition to come out on top. My relatives are no better. They're the kind of people who can't have a conversation without slipping in some kind of brag or gossip. It's always about who's buying a bigger house, whose kids are more successful, or who has the perfect marriage. Spoiler alert, they don't. Don't get me wrong, I know they care in their own way, but they can be a lot to handle. When I introduced Daniel to them, I hoped they'd see what I see in him, a kind, genuine, hardworking guy who's crazy about me. But instead, they were polite on the surface and distant underneath. It was like they'd already decided he wasn't enough for me. At the time, I brushed it off and tried to give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they just needed time to warm up to him. But then I overheard my aunt whispering to my mom, asking why I'd chosen some regular white guy instead of someone from our culture who understood our values. That hit harder than I expected. I didn't say anything at the time, mostly because I didn't want to stir up drama, but it stuck with me. It made me realize that no matter how much I love my family, they have this deeply ingrained mindset about what success and happiness are supposed to look like. And Daniel didn't fit their picture. That should have been my first warning. Fast forward to the days leading up to the wedding, and Daniel was doing everything he could to make a good impression. He had spent months, literally months, learning bits of my native language. At first, I thought he was just being curious, but then he told me he wanted to surprise my family by speaking in our language during the ceremony. He didn't give away too many details, but I knew he'd been practicing with a tutor and using online resources. I thought it was sweet, but I didn't realize just how much effort he was putting into it. That's just who Daniel is, though. He's the kind of guy who goes above and beyond for the people he cares about, often without making a big deal about it. I saw him sneaking in practice sessions after work, sometimes even staying up late to get it just right. Whenever I asked how it was going, he'd just smile and say, "You'll see." It didn't surprise me that he wanted to do something special like this. He's always been thoughtful and eager to make people feel included, especially my family. I think deep down he knew how much their approval mattered to me, even if I didn't want to admit it myself. And looking back, I realized he was doing all of this because he wanted to show them how much he respects my culture and, by extension, My family. But while Daniel was putting in all this effort, my family didn't seem to notice or care. In fact, as the wedding got closer, they seemed more focused on nitpicking. My mom would make these passive aggressive comments about how the guest list was too small and how it didn't look good to only have a modest venue. My dad kept asking questions about Daniel's job, subtly hinting that maybe he wasn't successful enough. Even my siblings, who I thought would be more supportive, kept making jokes about how different Daniel was. The day before the wedding, we hosted a small gathering at my parents' house for close family and friends. It was meant to be a low-key event where everyone could relax before the big day. Everything was fine at first, but as the evening went on, I noticed Daniel seemed quieter than usual. He's normally great at making conversation and putting people at ease, but he looked uncomfortable. I asked if he was okay, and he just gave me a small smile and said he was fine. Later, Daniel pulled me aside and asked if I knew what my family had been saying about him. At first, I was confused, but the look on his face told me it was serious. He explained that he'd overheard several of my relatives mocking him in our native language, assuming he couldn't understand a word they were saying. I could see the hurt in his eyes as he told me what he'd heard. They'd been laughing about his clothes, calling them basic and saying they didn't match the standards of our family events. One of my cousins had joked about his car, saying it looked like something a student would drive, and wondering about if he even had a real job. The part that really stung was when they started making fun of his genuine attempts to embrace our culture. One of my aunts mocked his efforts to participate in our customs, calling him an attention seeker who was trying too hard to impress us. Then, my mom's close friend, who has a reputation for being nosy and judgmental, chimed in. She went on about how her son, a successful doctor, would have been a much better match for me, and implied that I was wasting my potential by marrying someone who didn't understand our traditions. It didn't stop there. Several others joined the conversation, and the things they said made my stomach turn. They speculated that Daniel probably wanted a submissive wife, claiming that that must have been the reason he was marrying outside his race and culture. Someone else remarked that if he were as successful as he claimed, he wouldn't have chosen me in the first place, because no real man with options would settle for someone outside of his own world. I was horrified. I apologized profusely, but he just shook his head and said not to worry about it. I could tell he was hurt, but he didn't want to make a scene. He said he'd handle it and told me to go back and enjoy the party. I didn't know what he meant by handle it, but I trusted him, so I let it go. The next day, everything seemed normal until we got to the reception. After we'd gone through the ceremony, dinner and speeches, Daniel stood up to say a few words. At first, it was exactly what you'd expect. A heartfelt thank you to everyone for being there and a sweet tribute to me. But then, out of nowhere, he switched to speaking in my native language. The entire room went silent. His accent wasn't perfect, but he was fluent enough to get his point across. He addressed the comments he'd overheard the night before, directly calling out my relatives for their rudeness and judgment. He told them he wasn't just some regular guy, although he didn't mind being one. He revealed details about his background that even I hadn't fully known. He talked about his family's business empire, the investments he'd made on his own, and how he was wealthier than every single person in the room combined. He wasn't bragging. His tone was calm and matter-of-fact, but the message was clear. When he finished, there was a stunned silence before a few people awkwardly clapped. I didn't know where to look, Part of me was mortified, but another part of me was impressed. Daniel had handled the situation with more class and composure than I think I ever could have managed. Since then, things have been tense. My parents apologized, but I could tell they were embarrassed. Some of my relatives tried to act like it wasn't a big deal, but others were openly angry. They thought Daniel had disrespected them by calling them out publicly, but I don't see it that way. I'm also kind of proud of him for handling it so well, but now I'm worried about what this means for the future. Daniel always said he wants to blend our cultures, and while I know he's tough and can deal with stuff, I don't want him to feel like an outsider or constantly disrespected by my family. So now I'm wondering, how do we move forward from here? Can I really get past the way my family acted, or is this going to mess with our relationship in the long run? Should I just cut off the people who can't respect my husband, even if they're family? Or was Daniel out of line, calling them out like that in front of everyone? Honestly, I just want to make sure I'm doing the right thing for us, but I'm really not sure what that is. What would you do if you were me? It's been a few days since the wedding, and I feel like my brain is completely wrecked. Daniel and I were supposed to leave for our honeymoon the morning after, but we ended up postponing it. We agreed it would be impossible to enjoy ourselves while everything back home was such a mess. Instead of sipping cocktails on a beach somewhere, we've been stuck dealing with family drama, awkward conversations, and me trying to figure out how not to completely lose my mind. My parents came over to talk 2 days after the wedding. I was nervous about it because I had no idea how they'd approach the situation. My dad is usually the sweep it under the rug type, so I wasn't expecting much. But I was still holding on to a tiny sliver of hope that they'd own up to their part in this disaster. Spoiler alert, that didn't really happen. They started with what I guess was supposed to be an apology, but it felt more like damage control. My mom kept saying things like, "We never meant to hurt Daniel," and "You know how people gossip, it doesn't mean anything." My dad, on the other hand, jumped straight into the whole Daniel should have been the bigger person argument. He said it was wrong of Daniel to call everyone out in public, especially at his own wedding, because it made the family look bad. That was my breaking point. I told them straight up that the only people who made the family look bad were the ones who couldn't keep their nasty comments to themselves. I said Daniel didn't owe them silence while they insulted him behind his back. My dad tried to brush it off, saying they were just joking, but I wasn't having it. Daniel, as usual, stayed calm, which I'll never understand because I was about 2 seconds away from screaming. He told my parents he didn't regret what he said at the wedding. He said he hadn't planned to do it, but after everything he'd heard, he couldn't just let it slide. Then he said something that really stuck with me. He told them he hopes this can be a learning moment for everyone and that he wants to move forward for the sake of our future together. My mom seemed to take that to heart. She got really quiet for a moment and then said she talked to some of the relatives who were involved. But my dad? He just looked annoyed. He kept saying stuff about family respect and how this wasn't how things were done in our culture. I could see Daniel getting tired of it, but he just nodded and didn't push back. I guess he figured it wasn't worth arguing with someone who wasn't going to change their mind. After my parents left, I thought maybe things would calm down, but nope. The next morning, I woke up to a series of texts from one of my aunts, the same one who'd called Daniel an attention seeker. She basically said she felt attacked by his speech and that it was out of line for him to bring up money because it made everyone feel small. I didn't even know how to respond to that. I wanted to text back, maybe you wouldn't feel small if you didn't spend the night before the wedding tearing someone else down, but I held back. I showed Daniel the messages and he just laughed and told me not to waste my energy. Later that day, another cousin called to say he'd overheard some relatives blaming me for the whole thing. Apparently they think I allowed Daniel to humiliate them because I didn't stop him from speaking up. One even said I should have warned him not to take family jokes so seriously. The audacity. I couldn't believe they were still doubling down instead of taking responsibility. On top of that, my mom's friend, the one who suggested her doctor's son was a better match for me, decided to chime in too. She called my mom and went on a rant about how I should apologize to the family elders because it's my duty as a daughter to keep the peace. My mom told me about the call and hinted that I might want to consider making amends. I straight up told her no. I said I wasn't going to apologize for someone else's bad behavior, and she dropped it. But I could tell she wasn't happy. Meanwhile, Daniel's been handling this whole thing like a champ. He keeps telling me not to stress about it and that he's fine. But I know it bothers him. He hasn't said anything outright, but I've noticed little things like how he gets quieter when my family comes up and how he avoids looking at the wedding photos we got from the photographer. It's not like him to hold back, so I know he's trying to protect me from feeling worse. What's making this all a bit easier is that not everyone in my family is on the same page. A few of my cousins have actually reached out to apologize. One of them said she hadn't realized how toxic some of the comments were until Daniel called it out, and she admitted she'd laughed along just to fit in. Another cousin apologized directly to Daniel, which I really appreciated, but the rest? Radio silence, or worse, passive-aggressive remarks in group chats. The whole thing has left me feeling stuck. Part of me wants to cut off everyone who's disrespected Daniel, but another part of me knows that's easier said than done. Family ties are complicated, and as much as they've pissed me off, they're still my family. I just don't know if I can look at them the same way anymore. Daniel keeps telling me it's my call, but I can tell he doesn't want to be the reason I distance myself from them. He keeps saying we should focus on the people who genuinely care about us and not waste energy on the rest. He's right, but it's hard. How do you just move on when the people who are supposed to have your back show you they don't? For now, we're trying to take things one day at a time. We've rescheduled our honeymoon for next month, and I'm hoping by then some of this drama will have died down. But honestly, I'm not sure if things will ever go back to normal. Maybe that's not such a bad thing, though. Maybe it's time to redefine what normal looks like for us. What would you do in this situation? How do you balance sticking up for your partner while still dealing with family drama? I feel like I'm walking a tightrope here, and one wrong move could make everything worse. Hello guys, it's been a week now since the wedding, and while some things are starting to settle down, others are just not. Some of my relatives are still upset, and honestly at this point, I'm not even sure why. I think part of it is embarrassment. Daniel calling them out in front of everyone and doing it so effortlessly shattered whatever little bubble they were living in, and they just don't know how to handle it. That said, not everyone is doubling down. A few of my relatives have actually reached out to apologize, and it's been kind of surprising. One of my uncles, who's usually the loudest in any room, called me out of the blue. I braced myself for another lecture about family values or respect, but instead, he admitted he'd been wrong to judge Daniel. He said he'd made some assumptions about him based on stereotypes, and hearing Daniel speak so fluently in our language made him realize how ignorant he'd been. He even went as far as to say he was impressed by how Daniel handled the whole situation. I wasn't expecting that at all, and it honestly gave me a little hope. My uncle has always been a bit of a ringleader in the family, so hearing him say something positive felt like a small win. I told Daniel about it later, and he just smiled and said, "One down, a dozen more to go." Of course, not all the apologies have been that straightforward. One of my aunts sent me a text that was basically the most passive-aggressive apology I've ever seen. It was something like, I didn't mean to offend Daniel, but he shouldn't have taken things so seriously. We were just teasing. It's how we show love in this family. I rolled my eyes so hard I thought they'd get stuck. I showed it to Daniel and he just shrugged and said, "That's not an apology, it's a deflection." He's right, but it still bugged me. On the other hand, one of my cousins, who'd laughed along during the pre-wedding comments, actually showed up at our place with flowers. She looked super nervous and apologized in person, which I really appreciated. She admitted that she'd laughed because she didn't want to be the odd one out and that she felt terrible about it afterwards. It was the first time I felt like someone genuinely understood the weight of what happened. And I could tell Daniel appreciated it too. Now for the good news. Daniel and I finally left for our honeymoon. We decided to go ahead with the trip we'd planned, even though we were tempted to cancel it altogether after everything that happened. Honestly, I think it was the best decision we've made since the wedding. We talked for hours one night, and for the first time in days, I felt like we were really being honest about how we were feeling. I told him how ashamed I was of my family and how guilty I felt for not standing up for him more. He told me I didn't need to feel guilty and that he knew I had his back even if I hadn't spoken up in the moment. Since then, the trip has been exactly what we needed. We've spent our days exploring, eating way too much, and just enjoying each other's company without any outside noise. And for a little while, it's felt like we've left all the drama behind, and it's been such a relief. But of course, the family drama hasn't completely disappeared, even from afar. I've been getting updates, some welcome, some not. My mom texted me yesterday to say that a few relatives are now Team Daniel after talking to my uncle, who's been surprisingly vocal about admitting he was wrong. Apparently, he told some of the other uncles that Daniel earned his respect by standing his ground and handling the situation with class. On the flip side, my dad hasn't let up. My mom mentioned that he's been going around telling people that Daniel was disrespectful for not apologizing for his speech. I can't believe he's still clinging to that narrative, but at this point, I've decided to stop trying to change his mind. I'm done wasting my energy on people who don't want to listen. One thing that's been on my mind a lot lately is how this is going to affect future family gatherings. Daniel and I talked about it during the honeymoon, and he said he's willing to come to events as long as I feel comfortable. But he also said he's not going to put himself in situations where he feels disrespected again, which I completely understand. I'm honestly not sure how I feel about it yet. Part of me wants to just avoid the big gatherings altogether, but another part of me feels like that's letting the people who caused this win. For now, I'm trying to focus on the positives. This trip has reminded me why I fell in love with Daniel in the first place. He's been nothing but supportive, even when he had every reason to walk away from all this nonsense. I don't know how I got so lucky, but I'm so grateful for him. When we get back, we're planning to have a small dinner with the relatives who've apologized and shown genuine support. I think it'll be a good way to start fresh with the people who actually care about us. As for the rest of them, I'm still figuring that out. I'd love to hear how others have dealt with family drama like this. Do you just cut people off completely? Or is there a way to rebuild those relationships without compromising your boundaries? Right now, I'm leaning towards the quality over quantity approach. But it's easier said than done when it's your family. What would you do? Hi guys, first and foremost, I have to thank each one of you for sharing advice and even your own stories. Seriously, it's been comforting to know I'm not alone in dealing with family drama, and your advice has been such a big help. So here we go, hopefully for the last time. It's been a few weeks now, and while things have mostly settled down, I'd be lying if I said everything was perfect. Most of my family seems to have moved on, at least on the surface, but there are definitely a few holdouts who can't seem to let it go. I've made the decision to distance myself from anyone who can't respect Daniel or our relationship. I mean, life's too short to keep trying to win over people who've already shown they're not worth the effort, right? The big turning point for me happened a few days ago when I had a serious conversation with my parents. Started off pretty tense, as most of our conversations have been lately. My dad brought up the upcoming family gathering, a big annual thing where everyone gets together, and casually mentioned that maybe Daniel should skip it this year. He didn't say it outright, but the implication was clear. Some people still felt uncomfortable, and it would be easier if Daniel just wasn't there. That was it for me. I don't know if it was the fact that he said it so casually, like it was no big deal, or just the built up frustration finally boiling over, but I couldn't hold back anymore. I told him straight up that Daniel wasn't going to be excluded just to make other people comfortable. I said that if anyone should be skipping the gathering, it's the people who disrespected him in the first place. My dad, of course, got defensive and started going on about family harmony and keeping the peace. I couldn't help but laugh, bitterly. Not because it was funny. I told him that family harmony doesn't mean sweeping things under the rug and pretending everything's fine. It means holding people accountable and making sure everyone feels respected. And if they can't do that, then maybe they're the problem. Then I turned to my mom, hoping she'd have my back. I mean, she's my mom, right? She's supposed to be in my corner. But instead, she just looked uncomfortable. Not angry, not sad, just kind of frozen, like she didn't know what to say or do. I could tell she wanted to speak up, but she kept glancing at my dad like she was waiting for his permission or afraid of how he'd react if she disagreed with him. That's when it hit me like a punch to the gut. She wasn't going to step in. She wasn't going to defend me or Daniel, even though she knew we were in the right. She was more worried about keeping the peace with my dad than standing up for her daughter and the man I'd chosen to spend my life with. And honestly, that realization hurt more than anything my dad had said so far. But instead of letting the disappointment swallow me, I felt this surge of clarity. I wasn't going to beg for their approval, to keep hoping they'd magically come around. I was done playing nice, done tiptoeing around their feelings, and done pretending that Daniel needed to keep proving himself to them. So I told them exactly where I stood. I started off calm, but my voice got steadier the more I spoke. I said I didn't need their approval for my relationship because, frankly, their approval wasn't a requirement for my happiness. I told them Daniel had already done more than enough to accommodate them, way more than most people would have done in his position. I reminded them of everything he'd done to show respect and effort. I brought up how he spent months learning our language just so he could connect with them on a deeper level. How he embraced our customs, even when some of them were completely foreign to him, and how he never once complained or acted like it was too much. And then I called out the fact that he'd put up with their behavior at the wedding, the whispers, the judgmental stares, the outright rudeness, and still kept his cool because he didn't want to ruin my big day. My dad looked like I'd slapped him, and my mom just sat there quietly. And for a moment, I thought maybe I'd gone too far. But then I realized that sometimes the truth needs to sting a little. They needed to hear it. The conversation ended on a pretty awkward note, with my dad muttering something about needing time to think. My mom walked me to the door as I was leaving and whispered that she understood where I was coming from, but didn't know how to fix things. I told her it wasn't about fixing things. It was about choosing to do better moving forward. I'm not sure if it sunk in, but at least I said my piece. Since then, I've been feeling a lot lighter. I'm done tiptoeing around people's feelings and pretending like everything's okay when it's not. If my parents or anyone else in the family want to be a part of my life, they'll need to respect the life I'm building with Daniel, no exceptions. As for Daniel and me, we're doing great. If anything, this whole experience has brought us closer together. We've had so many heart-to-heart conversations over the past few weeks, and I feel like I understand him on an even deeper level now. He's been so patient and supportive through all of this, even when he had every reason to walk away. I'm so proud of him for standing up for himself and for showing my family that you don't have to stoop to someone's level to make a point. The other night, we went through the wedding photos for the first time since we got them. At first, I was nervous about it because I didn't want the memories of the day to be tainted by all the drama. But as we looked through them, I realized something. For every picture of a judgmental relative or a fake smile, there were 10 more of us laughing, dancing, and celebrating with the people who truly cared about us. Those are the moments I'm choosing to focus on. Looking back, if there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that true character always wins in the end. Daniel showed that in the way he handled himself, and I'm learning to show it by setting boundaries and standing up for what matters. So thank you to all of you for being here and investing time in my rant. Your encouragement has been a lifesaver, and I really appreciate it. Here's to better times, stronger boundaries, and choosing love over drama. Ciao. Stay tuned for more stories from our girl relationships.